And in our increasingly distributed lives, a number of us are using technologies such as Skype to talk and keep in touch and feel connected. It doesn't replace the co-present physical experience of being with someone, such as holding your child, but it allows you to feel a sense of presence until you next meet. But this difference between touch and seeing, between embodied and disembodied experience, did create some difficulty for my Japanese colleague when he had to participate in video conference meetings in English with American clients. He struggled to understand what was being said. And whilst reflecting out loud one day with me, it emerged that his Japanese colleagues, who did have a very good command of English, didn't have his problem. So for in the cross-cultural experience, with his broken English, the video conference seemed to have reduced the bandwidth of communication to that of words and grammatical fluency, of semantic and linguistic structure, which could be described as lying at the transactional level of communicating information. It hadn't offered my colleague the cues of co-present embodied space that he uses to be with another person, to speak and think with them and make sense of what they say. And it's often the case that breakdowns reveal the structures of how things work, and that's the case with communication too. The video conference situation suggests that it created a gap in the communication that affected the comprehension of utterances at the semantic level. And this gap may be described as lying at the relational level of human engagement. So in our face-to-face, everyday communications, the meaning of words can sometimes get missed or misunderstood because a gesture may have become too loud, or a voice was too quiet, an intonation ungrasped, a movement mistimed. And we may ask, how do I know that I've understood and that I have been understood? It's proposed that sharing a physical space allows us to experience this social uncertainty and enables us to manage it. When the bandwidth of complexity is reduced, the gap makes it difficult to make sense of what is said. And the video conference doesn't then mediate the communication. So I'm exploring what would it take for an interface to support how we relate to each other, and that it would need to support this bandwidth of human sense-making, our personal act of knowing. One of the things I explore is rhythm. Rhythm is a very important role to play in our sense-making. In daily face-to-face communications, we're connected in rhythm and synchrony at multiple levels, ranging from the moment-by-moment continuity of timed syllables to emergent body and vocal rhythms of pragmatic sense-making and processes of joining in. And this is some of the work that we're doing at the Centre for Music and Science. It's very interesting that if you just look at the turn, the pitch in the voices between each person, if they're in good communication and they're connected, the pitch levels are very similar. So our human capacity to synchronize with each other may be essential for our survival as social beings. Moving our bodies and voices together in time embodies a pragmatic purpose of being together. And in this synchrony of self with other, witnessing and being present become part of each other. There's lots of growing research now into how rhythm and synchrony operate in embodied face-to-face interaction. And this provides parameters for investigating the relations and differences in how we connect and are socially present in embodied and distributed settings, and understanding the effect of one setting on the other. So what's happening when we share a physical space of communication, a space of engagement? If you're standing in a field and another person enters it from far side, even though you can't see the details of their face or their features, you're aware of their existence, and you each become co-present and share that space. And we naturally orient our bodies to express how we seek to connect with each other, as Adam Kendon has shown his work on social interaction, where this involves standing in a circle, standing at an angle, directly facing each other, sitting next to each other, and so on. How we shape our presence affects how we make sense of each other. And the processes of sense-making through body movements, gestures, vocal sounds, speech, and stillness is akin to an unfolding dance. Edward Hall has written much about this. And that present in our fields of work and research, how we relate to others and understand them is variously referred to as dialogue, communication, conversation, interaction, engagement, and sometimes these terms are used interchangeably. Their origins have in common a commitment to relate to others. However, each has its own history and each undergoes a shift in the 20th century with the rise of science and computation as a methodology to study mind, behaviour, and culture. and some have been reshaped by cognitivism or rationalism, by which I mean knowledge of the world is independent of the human body and emotion, and utilitarianism, where reality can be objectively codified as data. And in response to both rationalism and utilitarianism, concepts of dialogue and interaction have been re-articulated to focus attention back to mutuality, reciprocal relations, the importance of social uncertainty, empathy, ethics, action, emotion, and the human body. Most of you are going to be familiar with this. Bear with me. So the philosophical and theoretical foundations for this change can be largely attributed to the force of philosophical works of Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, Martin Buber, Heidegger, Gadamer, Wittgenstein, Polanyi, and thinkers like Whitehead and Bergson. They've revolutionized how we think about ourselves as human beings, questioning how we think about ourselves in relationship to our environment and others in it, how we learn, how we make sense of our reality, and how being bodies shapes our perceptions and our understanding. The expressions used to convey how we relate to others now covers a rich spectrum of meanings, from mutuality, reciprocality, through to the sharing and transfer of information. But technology has tended towards the latter part of the spectrum that satisfies the utilitarian vision of a human user of things. The shift that's now underfoot is revisiting the former part of the spectrum of mutual relations to understand how we connect in our present at a personal level. So I think of dialogue as skilled performance. And since knowledge is carried in dialogue, knowledge is skilled performance. And dialogue is improvised, and at its best it feels good and flows, and we feel connected. I was asked recently that if a person was speaking in Chinese to someone who speaks in Japanese where neither understands the words, speech content of the other, would they be transferring knowledge? And I'd say they would be, of the kind that underlies our everyday contact with others we encounter. And it's of the kind that was crucial for my Japanese colleague to make sense of my utterance, when neither I spoke fluent Japanese nor he fluent English. Someone whom I met briefly at Stanford spoke of her experience of ordering food in a restaurant in France while visiting with her husband. She's deaf. He had tried without much success to make himself understood to the waiter using poor French, so she gave it a try. And using gestures and sounds, she was able to convey their needs with success. Her husband had attended to words. She had attuned to movements and sounds that would engage the waiter. And such improvisation is not about the one best way, nor is it possible to abstract it outside the person involved in it. It's a personal act of knowing. And it's not about certainty, but about moving with uncertainty and handling doubt. Managing uncertainty involves mediated awareness. I'll speak very briefly of Polanyi's theory of tacit knowing, which I suppose quite a few of you must be familiar with. In particular, the functional aspect of the structure of tacit knowing, which he uses throughout his argument. So consider the example of recognizing a friend's face. And this occurs through a functional relationship between what he calls two terms of tacit knowing. The first term, proximal term, is the features, and the second, distal term, is the face. He draws on proximal and distal from anatomy. We know the first term only by relying on our awareness of it for attending to the second term. So it's the proximal term of which we have a knowledge that we may not be able to tell. And through this functional structure of tacit knowing, we come to know the richer and more comprehensive dimensions of our common experience by focusing on or attending to their meaning from or through the less complex particulars of which they are composed. So we rely on some things in order to focus on others. Jerry Gill calls this dimensional and vectoral construing of experience, as it allows for a mediational understanding of the structure of reality. The dimensions together form a comprehensive entity. So in his discussion of the body in tacit knowing, particularly in learning tasks that involve the body, such as dance and music, Polanyi describes a skilled human performance as a comprehensive entity. And when two people share the knowledge of the same comprehensive entity, two kinds of indwelling meet. The performer coordinates his moves by dwelling in them as parts of his body, whilst the watcher tries to correlate these moves by seeking to dwell in them from outside. He dwells in these moves by interiorizing them. And by such exploratory indwelling, the pupil gets the feel of a master's skill and may learn to rival him. There's a very good study by Goodwin as a good illustration of this. In his paper, The Colour Black, He describes how a team of geophysicists judge when material fibres in a vat, a reaction vat, are jet black. He shows how simply saying jet black isn't sufficient for helping an apprentice measure and make this judgment. Rather, the blackness of black is learnt through physically working with the fibres and in talking about the experience, transforming private sensations and hypotheses into public events that can be evaluated and confirmed by a more competent practitioner. So geochemists use their body as media that experience the material being worked with through a variety of modalities. So these two, the apprentice and the expert, are undertaking exploratory indwelling and discerning colours through movement and their sense in order to share the knowledge of the same comprehensive entity of the colour black. So I investigate tacit knowing as a personal act of knowing by considering how can I can only see how you see if we share the experience in the same physical space. So exploring mediation as an embodied process within a collective act, where in the personal act of knowing, the body mediates experience of knowing how, knowing that, and knowing when simultaneously. In much of the discussion about tacit knowledge, implicit knowledge, experience, skill, people commonly refer to knowing that, knowing how, famously framed by Gilbert Ryle. But the temporal dimension is also very important, hence, especially, we don't make judgments out of time, we make judgments at a time. Why do we make a judgment at a particular time, not before, not after? So knowing when is also very important. For the next, I'm not going to read from this, I'm going to show a video. I had an opportunity to do an ethnographic study to look at aesthetic production, landscape architecture. And whilst I was there was a breakdown in apprenticeship. The firm had a base in the north of England and another base in Wales. They were downsizing, which means they were putting technology in order to replace certain more sort of heavy-duty labour tasks. So instead of having light tables, you start replacing them with computers. But this, just as this was taking place, due to lack of finances, the base in Wales, they couldn't afford to have any experienced landscape architects down there. So the junior apprentice was on his own, having to make judgments about the kinds of information they sent him without anyone to consult, except for the times when he was with them. So there's a few weeks before Christmas, there's a funding bid coming up. He's sent a whole load of examples to colour in some maps to show how the landscape around a road where there's been lots of accidents just need to know what the features of the landscape are. So he colours in all these maps, and along with some other information. And the maps are judged to be completely the wrong colours. His colours are completely wrong. So the senior architects ask him to come up to the company branch in the north of England and recolour all the maps with them. When I asked them, imagine you could have the ultimate seamless technology and you could just sketch and draw with this person so that he can share your sense of colour. Would they ever be up for that? And they said that no. They say he has to be in the same physical space because what he needs to do is to gain experience. So despite the company replacing many of their activities with technology, apprenticeship was the limit. This had to be done in a shared physical space. So I then looked at some of these videos when I went to Japan where the body became so salient because my entire life was affected. You know, even walking down the corridor and not knowing when to nod and when to look in someone's eyes became a daily thing to think about. So I became very aware that I needed to look at the body and how the body is mediating and conveying information and knowledge. I drew upon various research. At this point, I feel that I'm one of these people who's either looking through a telescope or a microscope, or we've been talking here about people looking through lens and looking at behavior. an activity, and I'm afraid that I go through phases, but I've used many methods, and that analysing videos is one of them. And what I was looking for was to see how does the body mediate information. I decided to look at sketching, because in sketching, people make visible what they're thinking. So it's a very useful, it was the one activity where there was loads of movement going on. Whereas if they were standing around the table looking at aerial photographs, there was less sort of very, very clear visible dynamics. Whilst I was looking at the videos, I began to analyze what I felt was salient moments. And during the analysis, I realized that these are moments when the bodies are moving in rhythm together. These are moments where you're letting each other know how you're understanding each other. Equivalent in some way to, in psycholinguistics, when people look at communication feedback, okay, yeah. How does the body do that? So I began with the idea of a feedback model, action-reaction. But there was one movement which didn't fit the structure of an action-reaction feedback. It was a simultaneous rhythmic moment. And I wanted to understand what the relationship of this salient rhythmic moment was to all the other moments that I'd noticed. What I noticed is that the salient rhythmic, when people, because I'm not reading, I'm thinking this loud. What you have is this is a 3.5-minute video of two architects. One is a senior architect and one's the apprentice. They're having to talk about redesigning a car park for a brewery site. And the senior architect is moving with very large gestures. He's looking at a large conceptual level, but at one point he lights upon the drawing regarding an entrance point from the car park. And the junior architect just zooms in on this. 3 times he tries to make a suggestion about making this a viable entry point. 3 times he's ignored. But the 4th time, something very interesting happens, and this is the clip I'm going to show you. This is the moment of simultaneous rhythmic synchrony. And it is the moment when they both move at the same time, and in doing so, they are able to hear each other's differences without conflict, and they are able to acknowledge the other. And for the first time, the junior architect is heard. And as he comes back off from the table, he breathes, his body relaxes. It's been very tense throughout the 3.5 minutes. It happens very quickly. It lasts, it's a movement of 1.5 seconds. But it just gives you an idea.
So looking at it from a very practical point of view, people get out of a car here. How do you get to the office? Do you walk? You go through here, and then we've got to leave some gaps. Obviously.
What is significant is that he touches, and it's only when the junior architect moves down that he begins to move. And as he moves, this chap moves in one stroke gesture, and as he moves off the space, he comes off. Senior architect comes over and makes a line. And each of them perform a gesture which is a summation of all the previous 3 moments. And for me, I find that really, really interesting. And I ended up working with musicians because in music, there is a natural beat response period of 1.5 seconds. So I was finding that all of the rhythmic moments that I was coding, where people are letting each other know how they're understanding each other, were all occurring within this bandwidth, this small time window. And then what I did was I then played with this. I went to Stanford and I had a chance to play around with some smart boards in a lab in computer science called the Interactive Workspaces Lab, and they very kindly let me play here. And what I did was I thought, oh, this is a very nice example of a surface which won't allow two people to touch at the same time. So I will be able to block this moment. And if I block this moment, then what happens? And what then happens to all the other moments that I had noticed when people are naturally drawing with pen and paper?
Oh, George, oh my God.
So not being able to touch at the same time means that people are having to hold their bodies back. It's not natural. There's tension built up. And then they will try all kinds of, all kinds of techniques to either intervene in the space, move back from the space, alter their breathing, hold their breath. But the problem is once they're allowed to come back into the surface, they move in together. Musicians call this entrainment. So the actual smartboard itself was not my interest, but I was very interested in how what the technology affords and in order to discover the relationship between this particular moment, this simultaneous rhythmic synchrony in relationship to all the other movements. And I realized that the connector really was rhythm. And I had blocked all the rhythm at the surface. The designs were awful, and the tension between the students was very visible. And when I let them go and draw on a whiteboard afterwards, they were so happy. They were drawing all over the place, up and down in front of each other. They felt they could breathe. So that was interesting. I had a lot more to say, but I'm not going to bother with that now. I will just very quickly, can we do the greeting synchrony video? It's just lovely. If it works. Sure. Yes. Okay, it's huge. It's huge. This is just me having some fun, playing around again with rhythm and co-adaptation. And so I've got, it's a lovely little clip. I have two people walking in from two different sides of the room. Synchronization, stopping at the same time, human greeting. This is also very important in musicians, for musicians when you're starting a performance. So I'm very, this is just part of my behavioural hat. I think I will stop there because there's lots more to say, but it will just carry on for a long time. I didn't mention the relational interface, which I think Nate had wanted me to talk about, but very briefly, or shall I just, I don't want to, I think, how do people feel? I know everyone's tired. No, it'll be a bit awkward to bring that in. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.